Hello and welcome to another edition of the Bull and Specs podcast, coming to you from right across the UK because I'm Shane O'Connor in the Midlands of the UK and he is...
I'm Adrian Lacey in the deep south.
Very deep south.
Howdy.
Yeah, howdy yourself with knobs on. We normally start the podcast with what we've been doing for our week. I don't think you're going to surpass last week's speed.
The famous trunk tapes.
Trunkgate. If you haven't heard last week's, please do yourself a favour and go back. And if you only listen to the first third of last week's podcast where Adrian talks about his swimming lesson, it is well worth a visit, I have to say. So after you, sir, what have you been doing exciting this week?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, I can't eclipse that. And in fact, I'm going to go right the other end of the spectrum and go nerdy, which of course is very in character for me, particularly as a former sound engineer. A friend of mine, former BBC colleague, when we were both sound engineers, asked me if I'd help him out with a mic test. And no, this doesn't get any funnier or sexier, so I'll keep it brief. But essentially, I had to do the same script, just going back to announcing days, and I hauled off an old History Channel script, and I had to run it 5 times for these 5 different mics.
Right.
And it's something he's doing to help out a distributor of mics, and it's for people to read his blog. Obviously it's going to be pros and nerds only, and compare and contrast the different microphones.
Do you know, I always worry about those kind of things. I end up booking an appointment at the doctor's because I listen to them, and because they do this a lot, don't they? On YouTube, they'll do like tests of various. I don't know if you've seen this. They do tests of various equipment, and
what did you call it? Unboxing.
Unboxing videos, yeah. Where they'll and then they'll do compare and contrast videos. They do it with guitars a lot and stuff like that, or amplifiers and things, which I'm a bit nerdy about. But I always like watch them or listen to them and think, I can't tell the difference.
No, exactly.
Hello, is that the doctor? I need a hearing test straight away, please. so beware. You know, if you're doing these things, you're probably setting people up to be hypochondriacs. You do know that, don't you?
Yeah, and I can only apologise. But what I love is the way, and it couldn't be more beautiful. My friend's name is Mike, and so he's called his firm Microphonics, which is lovely. And it's the words he uses to describe the different sounds that I'm struggling to tune into. You're like, oh, that's a bit crunchy, and it's U-shaped, the response. You know, it's a bit up at the end, a bit at the end. And flat to 6K was a phrase that was used. So some people will get that, and everyone else is a human being who doesn't get that.
Straight over my head, that one. I haven't got a clue. You're talking about the name of his company as well. Did I ever tell you about the guy I knew who had the engineering company? And said, oh, what's it called? And he said, Micron. I said, oh, that's like, because precision engineering, you know, you work into microns and micrometers and all that sort of stuff. And he said, no, my partner's called Ron.
That's lovely.
It was a bit disappointed, but there you go. Yeah. What was that? Flat to 6K in 60 seconds. What was that? What's that one?
That's to do with the response of the microphone. Are you still awake? Remains the same if you were to start at the lowest frequencies. You know, you can do it. Can you give us one of your Bill Mitchells?
The lowest frequency.
There are thieves about.
Yeah.
Look
anyway,
they're behind you.
Gosh, that's good. That's your party piece. I love that.
So if you start a frequency and then you go up to the...
So that you're down in the boots there, sort of 100 hertz. This is hertz is a measure of how high the frequency is. And then 6K is 6,000 hertz.
Oh, okay.
So that's more up the other end. That's more my domain, really, isn't it?
It's pretty exhausting, really.
Especially after the trunk incident last week.
Don't you think, though? Don't you think? And I remember having a conversation with an engineer that I work with, and because they're all a bit... I was going to use the word weird, but that's really unkind. They're all a bit... They're all a bit... into their subject, aren't they, engineers, like audio engineers? Don't you think?
You're tiptoeing, but yes,
you know what I mean. And
but that's true of anyone in any field where they're really passionate about what they do, isn't it?
I guess. But this guy was decrying. It was when minidisc first came out. It just shows you how long ago this was. Remember minidisc, saviour of the world?
Yes, in the Victorian era, I believe that was.
Yeah, it was like minidisc was like. I remember Michael Rodd. In fact, I had him about this when I interviewed him years ago.
Wow.
Michael
Name
Rod on
dropper.
do you remember when he smeared jam on a CD on Tomorrow's World? And then wiped it off and then played it and went, oh, nothing. And then we later found out that if you leave them in a slight breeze, they disintegrate. but he was having one of those moments about minidisc, and he was saying, he said the trouble with minidisc is they're not as good as CD, he said, because they chop off the low and the high end frequencies. And I said, well, I've never heard that. What do you mean? And he said, well, if you imagine, he said, if you were playing a piano, he said there are frequencies within the lowest notes that are not there if you record it on a minidisc. I said, okay, right. I said, so how would that affect the? He said, well, you can't hear them. I said, well,
but they're not there.
So what's the problem then? It's like if something takes all the. No, that's a bad example because you'd suffocate. Hang on.
All the air out of the room. Well, you wouldn't hear anything, yeah. No, what he's guilty of is oversimplification. He's actually tripped himself up with trying to oversimplify it. It's the difference between, we really will have lost our non-technical audience, but a WAV file and MP3, if people monkey around with sound files.
You can hear the difference in that, though, can't you? There is a differential that even I, with my damaged
cloth
and
ears?
distorted, my cloth ears, even I can hear that. So that kind of I get, but the frequencies that you can't hear, I mean, so what? If you're going to take them out, you know what I mean? Is it a problem? I don't know.
Well, it's a bit like hoovering. I once asked my mum, she said, well, you've got to hoover because there's things you can't see in the carpet.
Right.
That you need to hoover up. I said, well, if you can't see them, why bother?
It's true.
Which is why I never took off my career in housework and cleaning.
But that's a much better analogy than if you took all the oxygen out of the room.
It is. It's a bit more like it. I'm not coming round to your bunker with no air in it.
At least I played that one out in my head before I said it out loud, Adrian. That's the thing, really. Okay. So, anyway, so can we see this then? Is it on his blog then, or can you give us the details? Or
I don't know where it is at the moment. Well, I guess you could go to if you find Microphonics, he'll probably link to it.
Okay.
And it'll be on his Twitter feed as well, if anyone wants to follow it up.
I just want to comment on it and go, I know that bloke. Just a bit of fame.
Actually, if I know you, it won't be flattery, will it? I know that bloke, but he really shouldn't be in this business at all.
I know that bloke. I'd have done it better with the low frequencies. Yeah.
With my Bill Mitchell. How's it go? I can't do it.
Something like that.
For the man who doesn't have to try.
Too hard.
You do remember it. Anyway, enough about my week.
Yeah. Oh, my week, yeah. Well, I don't know if this is the same or same. I don't know if I mentioned this before. We had another midwife appointment.
Right.
And because
that's not you being a midwife, we should explain to new listeners.
No, because the wife is it's like it's getting a bit real now. Actually, this baby lark is it's on the way. I mean, most definitely. We found it. It's not a build up of pies. It is actually a baby. That has been confirmed.
Right.
But I tell you, it was just it was a thing that struck me about them. I asked the midwife. She's feeling around. She's like fertling around and going, "Oh, I think the head's there, and that's the bum there, and the legs are here." And I said,
"Is that your wife?" I said, "Oh no, that's the."
Yeah. I said, well, yeah. What about the baby? But she said, "All right, that's me. Thank you. Get your hands off."
Yeah, it's
sauce. But
so Barbara Windsor comes in
with the saucy music as she walks. Yeah. I asked what I thought was a simple question. I said, "Just tell me something. Why don't you just scan it? Why? What? You know, when you I don't know if you know this. When you're pregnant, you have 2 scans.
Right.
You have one pretty early on, and they confirm yes, it's a baby, and then you have another one, and they can determine the gender of that one, which is probably about 6 to 8 weeks later, something like that. Forgive me if I've got the timings wrong, but it's all been a bit of a whirlwind. And I said, I don't understand, because I said we'd a friend of ours, they got the where the baby was completely wrong. And it'd been a breech birth, and she'd ended up having an emergency cesarean.
Oh gosh!
So I said, so why don't they just scan it, and they know exactly where the baby is? And she said, well, it's like everything else in the NHS. She said it's all down to cost. And I said, but surely it's cheaper to do that than to have a theatre fully equipped for an emergency cesarean. but she couldn't answer that one. So, it's like where you're kind of up against a system that's established and is working and is already there, and you ask what you think is a reasonable question, and it's like kind of, well, I don't know what you're asking that question for. You feel like a bit of a fool, really, because I kind of think, I've discovered something that nobody, all these hundreds of thousands of women that are given birth around the world, if we just simply scan them, wouldn't that be a better way of finding out exactly where the baby is, just about 4 weeks before your due date, so they know exactly what they've got to do? I don't understand why that would be a problem.
No, I'm not justifying that, but I'm just thinking for trying to see it through the eyes of bean counters. So forget personal comfort or anything like that. Or distress, etc., etc. So I'm not saying I believe this, but if you're seeing it purely in monetary terms, I don't know. You'd have to look at what percentage would end up being a breech birth, stroke cesarean, and if it is such a small percent, I don't think it is, because I was nearly a breech birth, but in the very low tech days. Here's the thing: pre-scanning, no, not pre-NHS. Do you mind? But pre-scanning, my mum's the family doctor turned me around, apparently.
Oh, they can
manually.
do that. Yeah, they still do that. They still do that. Yeah.
That's not too dangerous then, presumably.
No, I think that's something that's done quite regularly. I don't think that's a big issue at all, and I think you're right. It's because it goes back so far. I mean, and then you start to think, well, I thought, well, with a scanner, I get that they're really expensive to buy, so you've got that capital cost which will go over the period of time. But other than that, the only cost that you've got is electricity and the person operating it. So they then cease to become an extraordinary cost, do they? Do you know what I mean? It's like,
no, you're right,
because you're not going to get a sonographer. Presumably, he's not paid the same as a consultant surgeon.
I thought you said stenographer.
No,
what, they're sitting there typing.
Sonographers, aren't they? They're sonographers.
I've
learnt all the terminology.
I can tell.
Sonographer, obstetrician, baby,
friends of the hospital,
nappy. That's the most frightening one. But yeah,
here's the thing. Did you know the word? I'm sorry to cut in, because I love words. At least I'm not a parent, so I'm struggling to keep up with you here. But I do know the word nappy. Which do you think is older, nappy or diaper?
I'd have said nappy, because doesn't it come from napkin?
It does come from napkin, but it's very much younger. It's about 1920s.
Wow.
Whereas diaper was originally used before we had the word nappy, because I had to write an old English type script. Don't ask. That's a few hundred years old. Diaper. So that's, if anyone says, "Oh, I hate that Americanism they've imported," they're actually wrong. You can tell them, because of course a lot of words went over to America on the first boat.
And where does diaper come from?
Oh God! Now you're asking.
It is
Latin,
half a story again. Half a blooming story.
So, if you're new to Bull and Specs, a reminder: I'm Adrian. He's Shane, and we, having set the scene with a little bit of detail about our week, we like to chew off a couple of topics that have been in the news in the last week or thereabouts. And I think it's high time, not least because they cropped up in the budget of all things, that we talked about driverless vehicles. Shane, are you up for that?
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't a day gone by since the budget that I don't know if it's like red car syndrome. If you buy a red car, you see red cars all the while. But since we saw it in the budget, we talked about it briefly. That's all I've seen is various stories about driverless cars.
Yes, and the interesting thing is, I mean, I'd have my work cut out if I was working in PR for these driverless car manufacturers and testers, because a lot of the stories, if you just search for driverless cars, comes up with and Mr. Google or Ms. Google trying to fill in the rest of your query often puts accident or crash after, and that becomes a story. And indeed there was one just over a week ago: self-driving shuttle bus in crash on first day. Now, if we started our first day like that at work, I've had a few car crashes at work, not necessarily on the first day, but if you dig into it a bit, it's usually down to our old friend, which is human error, which doesn't mean we don't have to be concerned about it. We have to be concerned, but it can be quite frightening from a PR point of view if you're defending driverless vehicles. But actually, the reality is, it turns out to be people chancing their arm a bit. And and expecting, I suppose, the offending person, as it were, the drivered vehicle, if we have to call it that now, is actually thinking, oh, I might just be able to squeeze in there or pull out just ahead of it or jump this red light, which happened the other day. Which doesn't mean, as I say, it doesn't mean it's not an issue, but actually you could say it's making the argument more for driverless vehicles. I've been told, because I got chatting to someone who's, don't ask me how, but he's involved on the ethical side of providing some of the software for this, and some of the issues they do your head in. He said the most dangerous time is what we're heading into, which is a mix of, as it were, manual drivered vehicles, whatever the term is, human beings driving vehicles, mixed in with driverless vehicles. That's the most dangerous time, and I fear that we're probably stuck with that, you and me, for the rest of our lives.
Wouldn't you expect that to be the safest time? Because you've got a driver, and then you've got braking assist, steering assist, radar in the car. Isn't that the time?
Sorry, I was thinking. I thought you were talking about babies and scans when you said cysts. Sorry, you're talking assist.
Do you know what I mean?
I went off on one there.
When you've got all that, I tell you, the thing that I always think of is aviation. We have the technology now to be able to have a pilotless plane.
Yeah,
and yet we don't. So if aviation don't do it, and aviation have got probably the most stringent safety regulations of any transport system, if they're not doing it, why would road transport want to do it, Adrian? That's what I don't get. Do you know what I mean? I don't understand why we would want to do that if we can't even do it in the air.
Well, I think the stuff in the air may well be to do with people's panic reflexes. Imagine you were told mid-flight that actually we haven't really got a pilot in the cockpit, but don't panic. That would be an invitation to panic. So I think it's humans struggling to catch up with the concept. But I mean, I like the fact you're asking the big questions. Why are we even doing it? It's almost like, why do you climb Everest? Because it's there. But I think, my guess is that the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, in his budget wanted to introduce it because it's absolutely inevitable. It's going to happen somewhere. And why wouldn't you want to be the first country to do it? Maybe you have an answer to that, which is because we don't want the accidents on our streets while they research them.
Is it all about accidents? I mean, I grabbed an article, the pros and cons of a driverless future, and the pros: more free time, okay,
right?
Because the cars will know where other cars are, so the risk of crashing is minimised, and you'd be able to get other stuff done whilst en route to wherever you're going. So you'd have more. So you wouldn't actually be driving the car; you'd be sat in the back, reading or whatever. Safety is another one. No more ownership, so they're saying that you wouldn't actually own vehicles. So basically what we're doing is we're turning cars into four-seater buses or trains, aren't we? Because they can only go where you allow them to go. Now, here's the thing, and this is where I look at it and I think, well, why would you want to do it? Is this about exercising control over the population? Because if I don't want you to go down that road currently, I can, or go to that place, say, for example. Say I don't want anybody to go to Ipswich, for example. It would be quite difficult. It would be quite difficult. I mean, I'm not going to do all the jokes about why and all the rest of it, but it would be quite difficult to achieve that. You'd probably have to put the army on the streets, wouldn't you, really? However, if you've got driverless technology and presumably some organisation that would be backed or supported or funded or controlled or regulated by the government would be who says where cars can go. If they just say, right, change all the software so nobody can go to Ipswich, that is frightening to me, because that all of the choice that you've had has gone. You can now only get in that vehicle and it'll only go to the places where they say that you can go. Don't you think that's a frightening future?
You're never short of a conspiracy theory, are you?
Who told you that?
That's what I like about you. Yeah, exactly. I think there isn't a conspiracy, but they want us to think there is.
Do you?
Work that one out.
Hang on. I've got it.
Yeah, I'll let you do that after the show. Yes, you can paint all these scenarios. I mean, it makes me think, actually, do you remember, I don't know, you are an iPhone man, by the by.
Yeah, I'm not
But-
an Apple fanboy, but I am. I mean, I've got one. I mean, I'm not
Right.
because it works. I'm not because.
Do you remember? Were you affected by this on the first day of the new millennium? I'm pretty sure because I remember where I was. We stayed in a hotel to see the new millennium in. Not a single iPhone in the country, or possibly the whole world, had its alarm working. We slept through, and I couldn't work out because I'd set an alarm. I knew we'd been up late, obviously. I set an alarm, and it didn't go off. And suddenly it was a news story that no iPhone's alarm had worked on the first day of the new millennium. And I thought, that's pretty creepy, isn't it?
But when you look at what I mean, do you remember the millennium bug and the scaremongering? When I
that's
hear
the
about
other
Brexit
side, isn't it?
now,
Yeah.
I always think about the millennium bug, and they go, "Oh, planes were going to fall out of the sky, ships were going to wash up on the shores of Birmingham, and all this kind of everything was going to go wrong." And worst of all, your dishwasher wouldn't work or something like that. You kind of think, okay, right, we'll see. And then really there was nothing, was there, the following day kind of thing. But yeah, you're right.
No.
There's mass technology when you've got it there and you rely on it, and then the day that it doesn't work, and it doesn't work for everybody, that is quite scary. But you don't think conspiracy then at all? You don't think this is a control? Because essentially they're taking away your car and they're making it a bus, aren't they? I mean,
Potentially, yeah.
One of the pros they said on this article was driving is available to everyone. Well, that's not driving. Driving is being able to get in a car and go wherever you want to go. This isn't getting in a vehicle that will take you wherever you want. That's essentially that's a taxi, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm, to be honest, I haven't chewed over that side of things. But if I can put the flip side of that, which is, if there is, we'll come back to your friend Ipswich. I don't know what you got against Ipswich. Some of our best listeners and viewers are, I'm sure, in Ipswich, as I try to keep them on board. But if it turns out that there is terrible congestion around Ipswich, suddenly because it's in the news, because we've raised its profile in some perverse way, then you could benefit in your, heaven help us, Google car, because it won't just head straight for the hotspots. It will actually avoid them, and so that's an upside, isn't it?
But what, a bit like your sat nav does now. What I mean, we've all been in that situation. We go, why is the sat nav telling me to go down? I'm not going down there, and you don't go down there, and you find out the way that you've chosen is quicker. So that will take you the way that wants you to take you, not necessarily the best way. So your criteria and the computer's criteria, or whoever's programmed the criteria, are not necessarily the same thing. I mean, if you imagine, right, okay, you get up in the morning, you're late for work, and you think, okay, I'm going to do 70 on the motorway today, and you can do that if you want and traffic permits. But if the government says, actually, no, today that motorway is going to be 60 mile an hour, there's not a damn thing you can do about it because your vehicle's only going to do 60 mile an hour. That kind of choice being taken away, I think, is really quite frightening.
And yet, if you say, right, I'm a libertarian, I know my rights, and also that is you, isn't it?
No, not at all, you cheeky sausage.
No, but okay. Leave my cheeky sausage to one side.
I'm
please.
just
But
all
if
I'm
you say sorry to finish the thought. If you say, right, I've got a right of doing 120 miles an hour on the motorway, and I'm jolly well going to do it. Well, what right do you have? Your right is against my right to safety, isn't it? And I might have kids in the car and all of that. And you'll feel differently once your son is with us. The idea that someone's free to do 120 and nothing.
You'll notice I didn't say that, though. I didn't say that you're free to break the law. I mean, and that is an important difference. I mean, you're absolutely right with that. Is that it's not about being free to break the law if you feel like it. However, you are getting to Minority Report situations then, aren't you, really, where you kind of think, actually, what are you doing? You're stopping people breaking the law by enabling them to never be able to break the law. Is that utopia or is that complete control?
As long as I can be Tom Cruise, I don't mind Minority
You get
Report.
one of those screens where you can wave everything about. I'm not really bothered.
I just touch that. I'll touch that. Yeah. But we must just touch on, talking of touch on the ethical dilemmas. I mean, these are huge. We'll just try and do it in 60 seconds or thereabouts.
Is this where they process the collision? Is that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, it's almost like your car's thinking through all the disaster scenarios. And I don't know. I mean, it could well know who's in the car and what the age they are. But again, I come back to this guy who's involved in the ethical side of programming AI, artificial intelligence, and so on, which is all going to feed into this. This is a whole hornet's nest. He said, what if you're in a car and your car, a driverless car, has got to decide between killing you and killing a pedestrian, or killing someone in the next car, or there might be a school bus. Does that get a special status? Or even, he raised the concept of what if there's a 200-year-old tree that's got special protection status and all of that?
Yeah.
Is it going to kill you, or is it going to kill a 200-year-old tree of special outstanding beauty, whatever it is?
Yeah.
And it does your head in to begin to unpack those things, doesn't it?
And again, it's who's making those decisions, because that will be made by a human, presumably, unless it's developing artificial intelligence as it goes along, and then it's making the decision and it's making that call. But initially, somebody would have to say a 200-year-old tree is worth more than Adrian Lacey.
Now, I don't want people voting on this.
Now, I've written a letter here that says these are my arguments for why the tree should win.
It's like, let's have a balloon debate.
Yes, yeah. So it looks like next week's podcast, if things go badly, could be me and a Dutch elm. We'll see how it goes.
A diseased Dutch elm.
You're listening to the Bull and Specs podcast with Shane O'Connor and Adrian Lacey. I want to turn our attention to prisons. I don't know if you saw this, Adrian. There was a story in the news this week about prisoners are ending up in huge amounts of debt because of the drugs that they're doing inside and the drugs that they're buying inside. And I thought, hang on a second. These are supposed to be prisons, for goodness sake. These are secure, sterile areas that this stuff shouldn't be able to get into in the first place. Is it too much to ask in this day and age that we shouldn't allow drugs into our prison? Did you see this? Did you see this story?
Yes, and the drug of choice often is this spice thing,
which turns people incredibly insane, doesn't it? Their behaviour becomes like wild and rabid almost. It's a really frightening drug. But when they're saying it's like £100 a gram.
I saw that figure, yeah. That's incredible before you start, isn't it?
And people are using about 8 grams a day, so they're like £800 a day habit inside. But that aside, I'm just kind of thinking, and I started to do some research about, well, how does it get there in the first place? And this is as big a problem in the US as it is in the UK, apparently. In fact, if not bigger in the US. And the number one reason that it gets into prisons is corruption, believe it or not. But they were saying some of the ways that they get drugs inside prison. Am I old-fashioned? Am I being a bit naive in my belief that this should be an expectation, that you should be able to say, look, these are prisons, these are places that people can't get out of, so how on earth are drugs getting in? That's not acceptable. Should we be allowing it? Am I being a bit ridiculous, do you think?
No, not at all. I think what is ridiculous, I think it comes back to our old friend, and we were talking about the NHS earlier, anything with the state involved where they're trying to cut corners. I think it's lack of staff, but you say also corruption, which probably feeds into that. It makes staff very vulnerable, doesn't it? And the fewer staff there are, the more weight is on their shoulders. But I mean, I don't think prison is the answer for a lot of non-violent stuff. I mean, I accept that people that we need protecting from, yeah, without doubt, they need to be locked away. But
yeah,
I mean, that's widening it out from the drugs thing. Well, I think if we don't spend money on it, there's such nervousness about stories appearing in the press about, they have such a cushy life, colour TV in their cells and all of that. And that will be true to an extent, but actually the reality is financially they're on their knees in terms of what they're trying to do, the number of people they're trying to squeeze into old Victorian buildings very often. And, if you lock someone up who started out angry, which is why they offended in the first place, or is part of the mix, it's not excusing what they did, but, if you lock someone up for 23 hours out of 24, do you think you make them any less angry?
Well, here's the problem. If you allow them to mix with people who are probably even more criminal than they are, won't you just turn them into criminals as well? Now, I'm not saying, perhaps I'm on the other side, perhaps I'm saying lock them up for 24 hours a day, and you have solitary confinement, although there has been research to suggest that can send you mad, can't it, if you do that? So maybe that's not the answer. But assessing people and saying, right, I'm not putting these people with those people, because if you do that, it's going to be the badness in those will rub off onto the not so bad on the others, kind of thing. But I mean, the worry is that we can't. You could essentially go in there clean and come out a drug addict in huge debt to criminal gangs. So I'm not quite sure how you've served society by putting somebody in that situation, because you made them worse than when they went in the first place.
Here's the thing, because I happen to know someone on the inside.
Have you ever been into prison, by the way? Have you ever been?
I have actually. Yeah, I went in as a photographer. So one of the times I did a little bit of professional photography, and
which prison?
That's a good question. A couple, actually. I went to what was then still open, Holloway Prison, which is a women's prison, which I believe is now closed. I'm not sure where the inmates went for that one.
I thought Holloway was closed, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think it was Belmarsh. That sounds very heavy duty, but I think it was, in South East London. I'm not going to draw too many conclusions from that, other than I was treated very courteously both by staff and by the inmates. I think they're not going to put a photographer in with the hardest crims out there. But I happen to know, when I say I know someone on the inside, they are working in a prison. I can't give it too many details. But here's some maths for you. This person works in an area with 90 inmates. How many staff do you think are typically on for 90 people? Now, of course, I don't know it would change with category levels. This wouldn't be the highest category, but I'd say sort of mid-ranking security level.
I'd say 4 or 5, 20 to 1, something like that.
It's 3.
30
so
to 1.
One person for 30. Yeah, it's like my old school, actually.
Wow.
Funny enough.
Yeah, maybe that's what they're basing it on. Actually, a class of 30.
Well, yeah. It's also interesting. It's based on the life of a monk. It sounds crazy. Stick with me on this. If you look at the lifestyle of how prisoners are generally kept, their day still reflects to some extent the life of a monk, probably going back to the Middle Ages, because that was the sort of model, that we'll make you pure somehow, which kind of didn't work, as we were just discussing, reoffending rates and all of that.
That is pretty amazing.
Yes, the solitary thing, or being in your own room, all of that's modelled on a monastery, would you believe?
What would you do with them if you wouldn't put them in prison? If you wouldn't put people in prison, say we're talking about non-violent crime now, and you're not going to put them in prison. Have you got a thought? Have you? Because I mean, we have in the UK supposedly a kind of like a working parties, don't we, that go out and do stuff in the community. I think that still happens, but not very much. I don't know. Would you do that kind of community service, as they call it here?
Well, I'm trying to remember the name. Perhaps you can help me with this. Where the victim meets the offender. There's some fancy term for that.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean.
Not restorative justice, or anyway. I'm thinking of lower level stuff. I've been burgled happily, touch wood, years ago in the past, but and let's hope it stays there in the past. But it happened a couple of times, and first time it's a bit. It upsets you a bit. And I'm not trivialising if someone lived on their own, perhaps, although not exclusively, a woman on their own. It can seem horribly threatening and all of that. So let's park that side of it. For me, once I got my head around it, actually, what have they taken? In one instance, it was a video player, so it tells you how many years ago. Oh, VHS player.
Right.
If I'd been given the option, you, Mr. Lacey, can choose whether this person goes to jail or whether you meet them and talk about why they did it, what the background is. I actually think in that instance, I would have wanted to talk to them.
Would you? See,
I think so. But I might be wrong. But if you put a face to someone, and actually I've heard on the other side of the fence, the the perpetrator, the offender, saying, "Oh, people say it's easy justice, soft justice, or something." He said it wasn't easy to look into the eyes of the person I'd wronged, and that may have been a more violent thing, not a property thing.
Yeah, no, with
but
property,
it is only property. It's replaced by insurance.
Exactly, there is that belief, isn't there? That, well, you're insured, so therefore that's it. You know, like car crime is exactly the same as well. But it doesn't take into consideration, and I through my radio career, I always used to hate it when people would try and grade crime. Politicians are quite prone to do this, where we say that attacking a child, for example, is worse than attacking a pensioner, or vice versa, because you can't lay one crime against another, can you, and say, well, that one's worse than that, because you don't know what the circumstances are to the victim of that crime, and you don't know how they will react and respond to being a victim of that crime. And so this idea that you put them all on the scales of justice and weigh them up and say, well, that crime's worse than that crime, doesn't really wash for me, because if somebody's murdered, is it worse to murder a child or somebody who's an adult? Well, the adult will be maybe the father of children. So children have lost their father. It'll also be the husband of somebody. So somebody's lost their husband, or somebody else.
But the judge is still, sorry to cut in, but the judge has still got to weigh it themselves in terms of the length of sentence. But
you can only weigh it in isolation, can't you? You can't weigh one again. You can't say, right, that crime. It's like saying my grief is worse than your grief. How the hell do you know that? Your grief is your grief, and that's the burden that you carry. You can't say that is worse than that one.
No, but if it turned out, just coming back to if I dare use the term, a milder offence, and don't forget, you would always have the choice, I'm sure, as a victim. You'd never be forced to face the perpetrator of the deed. No. But if it turned out, as I strongly suspect it did, the person who nicked my video machine, which got replaced within, God knows, 6 weeks or whatever, probably less, if it turned out they'd become a drug addict going full circle in prison on a previous occasion, I'd say, come on, we've got to break this cycle, haven't we? And it doesn't help us break the cycle for me to say, no, I'm not going to meet you. I want him in the slammer straight away, lock him up and throw away the key. He's taken the video player. Do
you think chatting about it would help, or not break the cycle? Because he's saying, would that completely fix it? And I accept that is a bit of a tall order. But do you think that would help break the cycle, just sitting and talking?
I really do, yes. Because I wouldn't be doing it for me, I don't think, other than perhaps a bit of, I don't know, almost journalistic curiosity. Of course, leaving aside, as I say, traumatic events and so on, just a property thing here, replaceable property, no sentimental value, and if as it turned out he was an addict, we've got to try something else. There's no point putting him back in the slammer, which made him the addict in the first place.
Yeah, I mean the bigger issue was really as well that the one that he stole was a Betamax. I don't know what's the matter with it.
Oh no, that should be a hanging offence, frankly, because they were higher quality. And let us not forget that I did have a prisoner in the family in the form of famous cousin Ronald Lacey in Porridge.
Aris.
So,
never trusted Aris.
You don't trust any Laceys or Harrises.
And that's where we've got to leave another edition of the Bull and Specs podcast. But rest assured, we'll be back next week to entertain you, hopefully, to chat about some of the news stories and to tell you what we've been up to in our week. In the meantime, of course, you can find us all over the place, can't you, Adrian?
We are indeed. Well, my performance is always all over the place, but
a bit like this podcast, isn't it? It's just all over the place.
Oh, I'll say we're on. I'm sorry, I do want to call it the YouTube after Uncle Bryn and Gavin and Stacey. It's their gag, not mine, but I love it so much. So we're on the YouTube. If you just search, just put the name of the podcast, but Bull and Specs, and the "and" is better as an ampersand. You'll find us quicker.
For some reason, don't know why that is. We never really got to the bottom of that one. We'll have to try and investigate that one of the weeks. If you just want to see, if you just want to hear, rather, you don't want to see the pictures, and we can fully understand why that would be the case. If you're going to be like that, that's fine. That's all right by us. But if you just want to hear the audio, as it were, maybe you're off doing something else and you'd rather be doing that. I listen to podcasts while I'm cutting the grass. I don't know about you. That's one of my favourite things. Although I couldn't tell that I'd blown my lawnmower up the other week, so Just a cautionary tale there. But yeah, if you want to just have the audio, Spreaker.com is where the audio actually lives, but you can also get it on iTunes as well. And it's the same if you just put Bull and Specs, but you've got to use the ampersand rather than the word and you should find us no problem at all. So until next time, thanks for your company this time, and we'll see you on the next edition of Bull and Specs.
Unless I'm replaced by a Dutch elm.